Time now for Culture Cast with Vicki McKenna. Vicki, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, Duke.
Well, you shared with me last week a really interesting article about the future of dome life, and I want you to introduce that article and let's talk about it.
All right. This is an article by a woman named Tara Thieke. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her name correctly. American Mind, which is a publication of the Claremont Institute. And the interesting thing about this article, it's not so much about dome life. You see that picture, it looks very futuristic. But it's about the concept of not being able to escape. And so going back to some of the dystopian stories and literature and some of the films that were made of this sort of, technocratic future that demands total fidelity to whatever the truth is declared to be by those in power. And that's really what she's writing about, is that as you see even more signs that Western civilization is starting to come undone, where do you go? Can you escape? You see the rise of what she describes as high modernity or the high moderns. It's the rise of a technocratic elite, not people who are committed to the truth, but people who are committed to a certain belief system that enable them to declare themselves more capable of making decisions for other people. They necessarily seize power. And so it's that concept she is talking about. And I think she makes an outstanding case that we are very, very close here in the West. It's not just the United States, but it's also other Western countries where if you disagree with the declarations of the technocratic elite, they will prohibit you from sharing information about your disagreement. There isn't debate. You've seen this in big tech. You've seen shutting down any kind of dissent in science and then somehow declaring consensus only and no dissent as high science. It is a complete unwinding of the principles of liberty, personal choice, and frankly, the foundations of Western civilization. And this is a woman who I think makes a powerful case that we are very, very close to being in a position where we won't have an elsewhere to go. We won't have a place to escape, as the Soviets did trying to get to the United States or the free Western world. Because all of that is now being managed for us.
Yeah, and I think it is a fascinating thesis. But if you go back 80 years, or even before that, the dystopian writers of the last century have been talking all about this. What's different now from then? I know you read the Brothers Karamazov recently. I teaching it right now. As far back as 1881, Dostoevsky predicted a future where messages were flying through the air, very much like email, and a web of technology, Dostoevsky predicted, was going to be able to allow greater freedom, but also for the autocrats greater control if they wanted to use that. And what's different now between the time of, say, George Orwell, who gave us 1984, very prescient, is that they finally have it. The techno-lords have created these global networks, and not only have they created global networks, but they have control over those networks that give them power even over governments. They seem to be controlling and dictating to governments what will and will not happen. And so I think that the final piece is in the place, now that the technocrats not only have the power, but they have the power to globalize and to bully, and if not completely shut down, if they chose to, certain elements of government. That's where we are today, and that's a very dangerous thing.
Well, and if you think of Amazon Web Services and how much control they have over the United States government, it's astonishing. I mean, this is a company that operated essentially at a loss for more than a decade while it was building up its ability to insinuate itself into all levers of power. And now, who's more powerful? My congressman, my senator, Chuck Schumer, or Jeff Bezos? And that's what this is actually about, is that, and you're exactly right, once the technocrats got control of information, and for that first 5 years of the internet, where people used to make declarations like information wants to be free, and this is fantastic, this is the Wild West of free speech, and look how wonderful we can self-regulate. That was never going to last, and we should have seen that. This is one of the things that this article actually makes a point in talking about, is missing the signs, and now even yet not being willing to take a step back and saying we can undo this, because we do still have power to undo this. But there doesn't seem to be anyone in power, in representative power, that is interested in taking on what now is a much, much harder fight. I mean, there's a United Nations document that was released last week. A friend of mine is talking about it, called Our Common Ground. And it is essentially the United Nations saying, now that these pieces are in place, now that we have control and fear and obsessive safetyism, now that we have all of these large companies having wrecked Main Street, having destroyed the concept of work for a living, having obliterated information, controlled information and faith, all these pieces are in place. Now it is time for the United Nations to slide in to the driver's seat and start making decisions. And that's not me being a crank or a conspiracy theorist. That is a document that was released last week. I mean, we are very close, in my opinion, to a socialist singularity that we may never be able to escape unless we want to escape the West to something that is perhaps even worse than what we're experiencing now.
Yeah, and there's nothing outside of the West that doesn't signify is coming along behind us to that same fate. Certainly, they're not going to win America and then leave Guatemala alone. Vicki, after the break, let's pick this up and talk about some of the consequences after the break. Back now with Vicki McKenna for the second part of our Culture Cast. You had mentioned the United Nations, and I think you're exactly right. They came out last week with a kind of a mini manifesto about this is the time. Right. We see what's happening with global COVID, the pandemic. The pandemic has taught them that even in places like America and the West, that mandates and lockdowns and huge government interventions in free rights, civil rights, they'll be tolerated if you can convince people or lie to them enough that it's quote unquote for their own good. But even with the United Nations, we've been talking about Agenda 2030 for 30 years, right? And 2030 basically said, let's move people out of the suburbs, get rid of suburban living, pile people up in cities, cluster them in small relative areas of real estate where everyone's going to be packed, and close off the rest of the world to them.
Absolutely.
That is the dome.
And you're exactly correct. And then you are 100% dependent on the elites in power. You are purely dependent on their good nature. But notice how they have behaved. Notice how the city of Minneapolis or Portland or Seattle or even Madison, Wisconsin or Milwaukee, Wisconsin have behaved. Chicago. You can throw all kinds of examples out on the utter and you can almost say predictable cascading dysfunction and it's never so bad. It never gets so bad that you just reject it. I mean, people, I hate to use the hackneyed, example of the frog in the pot of water, but Daniel Patrick Moynihan once said, this is what defining deviancy down means. You will put up with so much awfulness and you will convince yourself that that's the new state of normal. And so you're waiting for an ever lowering standard of awfulness before you finally start to act. People are going to be dead in the streets before anybody figures out that it's just too awful to tolerate en masse for any additional period of time. Back to the United Nations. The interesting thing about that declaration, I mean, there's a lot of stuff about the Great Reset. And that's a quote from Klaus Schwab, who had said, this is our opportunity. COVID is our opportunity to now reset the markets of the world and the choices of the world to align with the choices that we believe are better for humanity. They truly believe that they are Mr. Wither in that hideous strength, and they are just more capable and qualified to making decisions for the little people. They truly believe that. But it's about what you see about science and information in that document. Science isn't science. Science has become utterly a construction utterly of politics. Science is about what the people who are in charge want science to be about. And so that is how we can have declarations that natural immunity is meaningless in COVID, or that someone can declare that earthquakes are caused by climate change when that's manifestly insane. And that is the scarier thing, is that you couldn't even escape by pointing to actual objective science if we ultimately get this global dome life that it seems so many people believe. is appropriate for governance of the entire population of this planet. I mean, they think they're the United Federation of Planets. They think they're Jean-Luc Picard, and that they're going to act benevolently. But we have already seen what benevolent looks like. Benevolence looks like Andrew Cuomo sending people to their deaths in nursing homes.
Well, what you're talking about is not science, actually. It's scientism, right? It's the
Correct.
It's the elevation.
It's a philosophy, yeah.
It's the elevation of science to the level of religion and all-encompassing world religion. You mentioned that hideous strength. That's exactly the dystopian world that C.S. Lewis was imagining. And I'll tell you, at the university, to close this out, I'm seeing it in the younger kids, too. College-age kids are authoritarian already. We had a long conversation in my class yesterday where it's almost always females. I got to tell you, it is almost always women who are arguing that you shouldn't be allowed to speak if you hurt people's feelings, that language has to be policed so people don't get their feelings hurt. It is stunning to me how young females in this, college-age females in this culture have already completely and utterly conformed and are willing to go along. You label something safety, they'll march right behind it, no matter how fascist it is. I actually used the word. I said, you're being fascist and don't even know it. What gives you the right to tell me I can't use the word fireman anymore because somebody may be triggered by it, and then you turn around and tell me I can't use the word trigger anymore because that evokes guns, and they're 100% behind this kind of banning of language already.
You know, way back in the day when music still didn't suck. Remember when Simon and Garfunkel did The Sound of Silence? Yeah. That's what we are coming on. Listen, so many people saw it, Duke. Dostoevsky saw it. C.S. Lewis saw it. So many of the great writers saw this happening. Robert Bork saw it in 1996 with his book Slouching Toward Gomorrah. People didn't pay attention to the signs. We're not at the beginning of this. We are coming up to the closing act, and there is very little time left to start pushing back. And I don't have a lot of confidence simply because too many people are already slowly being cooked and don't even realize it. Right now, they just think it's a little warm.